Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining in on the Marine Institute Graduate Society Seminar Series. We normally meet every Wednesday during the semester, but we have a couple gaps in the schedule coming up, although the last 7 weeks are full. But I'll keep everyone updated on that. In the meantime, you can find the seminars on the MIGS YouTube channel on that account. So before I introduce our guest speaker, we would like to provide a land acknowledgement for Newfoundland and Labrador. We respectfully acknowledge the territory in which we gather as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk, and the island of Newfoundland as the ancestral homelands of the Mi'kmaq and Beothuk. We would also like to recognize the Inuit of Nunatsiavut and Nunatsiavut and the Innu of Nitassinan and their ancestors as the original peoples of Labrador. We strive for respectful relationships with all the peoples of this province as we search for collective healing and true reconciliation and honor this beautiful land together. Please join us in welcoming Dr. Anna Braswell as our seminar speaker. Dr. Braswell is an assistant professor at the University of Florida. She got her Ph.D. in environmental science from Duke University in 2017, which is cool. After her Ph.D., she took a postdoc position at the University of Colorado, where she actually used Zillow data to look at the interaction between coastal wetlands and the development of coastal communities, which I thought was pretty fascinating. I'm not in that field though, so I don't know how novel that is, but it was really cool. Anyway, Dr. Braswell primarily studies coastal ecology and land development. And right now, I'll let you take it away from here, Anna.
Thank you so much, and thanks everyone for having me. I'm excited to be here. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking to you. Hold on one second. Let me make sure I can advance. Okay, there we go. Okay, today I'm really going to be talking to you about how we can better understand coastal wetland persistence and what frameworks we might be able to use to better understand the multi-drivers of wetland persistence. So we're going to start out here. It's a beautiful wetland. It's on the coast of North Carolina. It's a lot of junkus going on in the foreground, but these local places are often driven by drivers that are much bigger than what they are. So when we study things at the local scale, we're also incorporating boundary conditions and forces from everything from watersheds to marine conditions to people. So how can we better understand how these bigger drivers influence our wetlands and how they persist into the future? To just give you a little bit of an outline, I'm going to go through a couple of things today. So first is just really an introduction to like what is a macrosystem and what is macroscale ecology. And then I'm going to take you through briefly through four different studies, kind of going through the different scales of what I'm talking about and the different influences. And then finally try to put it all together within that framework to see how that framework might be helpful for us. So let's start here with what is a macrosystem. So if we think about ecology and the scales of ecology and kind of where we work, we can think about spatial scale and we can think about temporal scale. So we have spatial scale here on the x-axis going anywhere from a meter squared up to the entire globe. And we have temporal scale on the y-axis going from a year to, the entire history of the Earth. And we often think about the ecological studies that we're doing kind of at this micro scale. So somewhere between a year to hundreds of years and a meter squared to, square kilometers, basically. And the things that we think about are how fire regimes or disturbances impact these ecosystems, or how competition interacts in these ecosystems, and thinking about things from the scale of like a plant all the way up to a stand of plants. We also think about the mega scale a lot, and particularly in things like geology, we can think about plate tectonics or the evolution of biota. And these things are really at the global scale, thinking about how our Earth operates and how it was formed. What we often tend to, or it's hard to study, first of all, but we sometimes neglect is this macro scale. And that's on the order of hundreds to thousands of years, and thinking about whole ecosystem changes. Things like soil development, glacial, interglacial climatic cycles, species extinction, ecosystem change, and really thinking about it at the scale of an ecosystem all the way up into whole continents. So when we think about, okay, that's the scale that we're operating at. What can we do to kind of put the different scales in a hierarchy? So Again, if we're thinking about how we normally do things, level 2 is the focal level of study. It's where we're doing our studies. And we often think about the boundary conditions. So what are the conditions that are in the environment there? But if we put it within a hierarchy, we can start to think about how things emerge, mechanisms control at the local level that emerge into our focal level of study, and then how those boundary conditions, the bigger things, actually control that focal level of study, like by providing that context. So when we add these two things together, what we really are getting is macroscale ecology, thinking about how these different scales operate and influence each other and the different dynamics that happen to cause what we're seeing at our focal level of study. And this is work that has been fleshed out a lot at Heffernan et al. 2014, which is a work really speaking about macroscale and how they operate. So you can see on the left the conceptual diagram that they came up with that talks about the different types of emergence and interactions you have in these systems. So for instance, like a macroscale feedback, a great example of that is the effect that vegetation and whole, stands of vegetation have on the climate. So if you have vegetation, it influences precipitation. So your forest is going to influence your precipitation and your climate, and the climate will then influence the forest, which is that feedback. You can also have things at the macro scale, such as, again, those vegetation patterns that influence the local scale. So obviously the vegetation that you have at that macro scale is really going to dictate what happens at the local scale. But you can also have emergence from that local scale. So smaller things that happen at the local scale can influence patterns that you see at the macro scale. And finally, you can have teleconnections, which is more of a global thought, which is things that are seemingly very disconnected, very apart, being connected in some way. And the best example of that is here on the right-hand side, which is snow geese. So snow geese winter in the US, often in the Midwest, in places that are now agriculture, and then summer up at Hudson Bay. And as humans and economics and agriculture have grown in the US, we've seen that those snow geese have proliferated because they have ample food resources here in the winter in those fields. And that has meant that Hudson Bay has had real problems with collapsing wetlands. And so these seemingly disconnected systems, Hudson Bay and the Midwest, are connected by these birds that have caused real ecosystem change in Hudson Bay. We can also think about the Amazon as a great example of thinking about the macro scale, where global economics and economics drivers have influenced pasture demand and the demand for beef, which really can change the dynamics at the local scale. So who decides to clear land, get rid of rainforest, change it into grazing land, and that can then emerge into the vegetation cover as like the many different groups make those local decisions, can emerge into the vegetation cover where we're seeing this transition between rainforest to savanna. And then that change has influenced the regional climate, where we see that the change from rainforest to savanna changes the precipitation, changes the climate of the Amazon, so that it's really these small local scale changes that are influenced by a larger economic driver causing changes to the regional ecosystems and the ways that climate operates. Also inherent in these systems, thinking about the macro scale, is not just the biological and geophysical parts of them, but also humans. You have to put humans in this mix when you're thinking about things at this scale. So these are just, this is just a diagram of all the different examples of concepts that you can think about at this scale. But I think really considering how humans influence these ecosystems at that scale is really important, because you can't discount them when you're thinking about the larger drivers of change that we see in our world today. Okay, so that is a bit about macroscale ecology and some examples to kind of get you in the right frame of mind of what I'm talking about. But here we are back in this marsh. So what does that mean for coastal wetlands? Historically, we've thought about the drivers of coastal wetlands persistence really being soil elevation. So this vertical driver of like, how high is that coastal wetland based on sea level? And will that coastal wetland survive sea level due to its elevation? And we've really thought about that in two different realms. So the biomass, or the organic matter that is accumulating in that soil, plays a role in that ecosystems persistence. But we've also think about the abiotic drivers. So there are things like sedimentation, and you have sediment coming from both marine environments and watersheds that influence that soil elevation and can control the persistence of that wetland. And then we also think about how those boundary conditions, the larger things like CO2 and sea level rise, can influence these variables and of what we really care about, the soil elevation of our wetland. But we can start to take that local scale and expand it out into macro scale and try to understand better kind of what those boundary conditions actually mean. So the plant growth can be thought of as more like regional wetland patterns. How do regional wetland patterns influence that plant growth? Or how does climate influence the way that we have erosion and subsidence and storms that affect the sedimentation of our wetland? And how do people, such as upstream land use, affect the nutrients that can then affect decomposition and the organic matter in our wetlands? So trying to connect those local scale drivers to more broadly to the macro scale. And finally, we can start to think about this also at the global scale. So how do things like global carbon dynamics influence the climate and of a wetland? Or how can wetlands help with like saving a bunch of carbon and influencing the global carbon budget that way? Or how has human migration influenced these different patterns? And to do this, we really need to combine different types of methods and different types of people. So we've done a lot of work at the local scale. This is often done through field work, which is super important, especially with understanding the mechanisms that are going on at the local scale. But to really think about things at the macro scale and global scale, you not only need field work, but you also need geospatial analysis and data analytics to get a better idea of kind of the patterns that we see more globally. So it requires both diverse methods, but diverse teams to employ those methods. Okay, so we've talked about the macro system. I'm next going to talk about a study where we're really considering those local processes and how larger scale dynamics can affect local processes of a wetland. So our knowledge about how wetlands are affected by things like salinity and flooding go back to this idea of like a transect where you're going from the water's edge up into the uplands, and that there's these stressors that affect the plants along that transect, where you have places that are closer to the water that get flushed more regularly, that get the sediment first, that are end up being higher or happier. You have happier plants and bigger plants there, whereas you go along that transect kind of into the interior in the middle to high marsh zone, things get more stunted, there's more salinity, there's less pulsing of that water. Sometimes water sits there and it becomes anoxic and you get more stunted plants. So we know that there's these differences in the ability of plants to persist and be productive in these areas. We also know that wetlands, particularly in the southeast, are affected by these large-scale disturbances. So we have frequent hurricanes that can be both a pulse and a disturbance. So they can bring sediment in and provide elevation to those wetlands, but they can also destroy. So they can kill vegetation, they can erode. So depending on the hurricane, you could have various effects from that disturbance. We also have fires in the southeast. So here's a picture of a fire that's burning a high marsh in Mississippi. So we really wanted to understand, okay, what are the impacts of these large-scale disturbances in salt marshes, particularly along these transect from going from like the healthy plants into the more stunted plants. And we picked out Grand Bay, Mississippi. So here's a picture of a fire in Grand Bay where the pine hammock is burning and it's jumped into the high marsh zone where there's a lot of dead plants and it's dry, and so it's able to burn there. And we decided we were going to do a prescribed burn there to understand the effects of this disturbance on those processes. And we chose that, we did our baseline studies, and then we got hit by 2 hurricanes, as happens along the Gulf Coast all the time. So we got hit by Gustav and Ike. It wasn't direct hits, but both hurricanes put over 1 meter of water on our site, and really was, and weren't very destructive, but did end up putting a lot of water on our site. So our primary question because of those two interacting disturbances became what are the effects of fire and hurricanes on the soil building processes in a salt marsh ecosystem. And here's a picture of us doing the prescribed burn. And we really wanted to address how large-scale disturbance can affect the primary productivity and the accretion that are really the two processes that help build elevation in the soil. And we had some hypotheses. We really thought this might be path dependent. So if you had a hurricane first, you would expect that the hurricane would move a lot of the dead debris around of the rack out of the marsh, but the plants, because there were a lot of healthy plants, would slow down the water and you'd have a good amount of surface accretion from that hurricane. And if you had the fire second, because you've moved the dead stuff out, it wouldn't burn as well. So you would have less plant death. And that would mean that there would be more plants to catch and trap sediment, meaning that you had more accretion. And if you had the fire first, you would expect that there'd be more dead stuff in that marsh that would burn more intensely, and you would have more plant death, leading to that hurricane scenario with less accretion because there's less plants to help trap and slow the water and deposit that surface accretion. Unfortunately, we couldn't test number two, but we could test number one. We're still waiting on an example where we can burn and then have a hurricane, which is a little bit more complicated than having the hurricane first and burning second. So we're really testing this first scenario to see if this is what's happening. So we had 6 transects going from the pine hammock to the bayou, burned and unburned. The unburned are in yellow, the burned are in red, and we were collecting pore water, accretion, redox, and above and below ground biomass at each of these 3 plots along the low, mid to high transition to that pine hammock. And the first thing that we found is that fire is very good at getting rid of biomass. You can see a picture on the left with before the fire and a picture on the right after the fire, and it did a decent job of getting rid of a lot of the plants. And if we look at the data, so the top graph is our unburned sites, and the bottom graph is our burned sites, and this is live above ground biomass over time. So if we look at this data, we can see that the hurricanes, which are this blue arrow, really don't cause much of a change in our biomass. So we saw that biomass stayed the same pretty much after the hurricane, although it did move our rack lines out of the marsh, which means it was much harder to burn. But what we did see in these burned plots in B with the red arrow is that we saw a really strong decrease in our biomass across the board with all of our different plot locations. But what was really interesting is that those locations really determine the recovery. So in the low areas that are healthier, that are pulsed more and are less flooded all the time, we saw that the recovery happened much more quickly than the mid or the high marsh plots, where it took longer for those plants to recover to their pre-fire biomass, really showing that these burns can have different effects depending on where you are. And it might mean that within a marsh, if you're burning places like the high marsh, they could be a harder recovery or not recovery depending on the conditions after a burn. And what we found with the hurricanes was really a big effect on accretion. So this is accretion, the same setup where the unburned ones are in the top, the burned ones are in the bottom. And we saw that the hurricanes really drove accretion. So we saw this huge pulse of accretion after the hurricanes that kind of was there the entire time. There wasn't really any change due to the fire. So the accretion that had come because of the hurricane stuck around, and we didn't really see much of an increase or decrease after that. So we didn't see effects of that fire on the accretion rate, probably because the burn was not as intense due to the rack line moving out and there being less dead stuff to actually burn. So what we found to conclude was that vegetation is mainly affected by fire, kind of as we were expecting, but that because that dead stuff had moved out, the fire wasn't as intense as it could have been, and therefore we had a lot of plants still around to kind of keep that accretion around from the hurricane. And accretion was really boosted by this hurricane, possibly pointing to hurricanes being a really important driver in the Gulf of wetland elevation and persistence, as if that hurricane is a beneficial hurricane rather than one that is eroding. Disturbance impacts were different across the transect. So we saw that those plots, depending on where you were in the marsh, you had different effects from these two disturbances, where the low marsh tended to recover better and have more accretion than the high marsh and the mid marsh. And we expect that these measured effects are path dependent. Again, like we have not been able to do the other side of that study. You know, hopefully one day we'll be able to predict a hurricane so that we can have the fire first and the hurricane second. But we did see that, at least the first part of our hypothesis seemed to be correct, that the accretion stuck around longer because there was more plants around because the rack had moved out. Okay, so now we've thought a lot about how these bigger disturbances can have an effect on local scale processes that really determine the soil building of the marsh, that has an effect on the persistence of the marsh. So we're back here thinking about this lovely marsh in North Carolina. And what we're going to talk about next is watershed connections. So how do watersheds really influence the ability of these coastal systems to survive? So we know that that in some ways, when you're thinking about geologic timescales, salt marshes are ephemeral. They are only around until the next interglacial cycle. So when sea level rise goes too high or too low, they either drown or they dry down. For instance, if you're having an ice age and all that water gets bound up in ice, they dry down. Or when you're melting a lot, they drown because there's more water. So they're constantly kind of like migrating up and down the elevation of the coastline, depending on when where you are in that glacial cycle. And so what that means is that we have this feedback between water level and plants and the persistence of the marsh. So at a steady rate of sea level rise where it's small, you have water that comes in. Those plants trap the sediment within that water by slowing the water down and allowing it to drop out onto the salt marsh surface. And it gets, they can persist through a little bit higher sea level rise because more sediment comes in, and so they're able to trap more sediment, meaning that elevation of the wetland is growing faster. But at some really high rate of sea level rise, they drowned. And that is kind of the quandary that we're in now with salt marsh persistence is, will they be able to maintain themselves in place, or is it really going to be this migration inland of these marshes? So with this, we know that most of our marshes along the coast of North America formed after the end of the last ice age, and after that huge amounts of sea level rise had already happened and we had a more steady rate of sea level rise, that those marshes were able to be formed and grow. We also have some evidence that deforestation post-European colonization has also formed wetlands. So here's an example from Kerwin et al. On the left from Plum Island, where they found over 50% of a marsh there had been formed after European colonization, possibly from deforestation for agricultural land upstream, bringing sediment pulses downstream to really form this wetland. And we've also seen this in the Birdfoot Delta in Mississippi with Tweel and Turner, where they found that as the Mississippi's huge watershed started to be turned into ag, that there was massive pulses of sediment coming downstream. And the light gray in this picture is everything that they hypothesized was formed post-European colonization and that deforestation event in the Midwest of the United States. So we know that this has happened, but where? This is a really complicated picture. I don't want you to focus on the details. It's really the colors of it. So these are a bunch of long-term ecological research sites, and the colors mark like different time periods from pre-agriculture to ag to industrialization to post-industrialization. And what you can see here is that there are differences regionally in when this is all happening. And that can matter because dams also come in that can block sediment movement down a watershed and can really starve wetlands of sediment. So we have all of these different land use histories going on across the United States, but also dams coming in. So how does this play a role in where we can find this evidence of humans being the reason for salt marshes to form? So that was really our question, is like, where is this happening? And so to do this, we really relied on using other people's data. So we made a core database where we're going back and finding every dated marsh core, salt marsh core that we could find, and putting it into a database to try to understand the regional dynamics. So we came up with this database that looks at the age of the marshes you see here on all the dots, and then started to add some different proxies in that could also be reasons that a marsh would form. So one was distance from the ocean, and distance from the ocean is a good proxy of like the marine environment. So the farther away you are from the ocean, the less likely that a marine storm or that erosion with an estuary is going to affect that marsh. Marshes that are closer to the ocean often have, storm events, have erosion happening, and therefore there can be many different drivers besides watersheds of that age or formation of a marsh. Then we also looked at river to tide ratio, which is a measure of the amount of water coming from a river versus the amount of water coming in on an incoming tide. And places that have a higher ratio have a bigger river and possibly a bigger sediment source into that estuary as compared relative to that estuary. And we looked at this regionally as well, thinking that regions might have something to do, that regional history of both colonization and agriculture might have something to do with the signals that we see. And we also followed this up by supplementing it with our own cores. We went and cored and radiocarbon dated marshes from around the Atlantic coast. So we looked at places in Massachusetts, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, really pairing sites together, one that had a high river to tide ratio with like a very large river versus one that was more of like a lagoonal system, one that with a low ratio, no river coming in, to kind of contrast those two things as a way of supplementing this data that we had from the database. This can be complicated data to talk about, so I'm going to walk through the predictions because I think it's a good way to be able to interpret the graphs. On the x-axis is increasing age. So as we go from like the left-hand side of the graph to the right-hand side of the graph, it's increasing age. The y-axis is the count of cores that have that age. So when we think about what I've talked about is like in the previous part of this, the different ways that wetlands can form, when we think about those different drivers, they would probably have different signals in age. So as sea level rise slowed down, we would expect a lot of wetlands to form. So we have this event of the sea level rise slowing down, and after that, we would expect a huge amount of cores to come back with around that age, being between 4,000 and 6,000 years old, and our distribution is going to look like that if that's the case. We would also expect that if you have a large river, that can happen more quickly as things stabilize and you have a really good sediment supply, you're going to form more quickly. So the places that have a big river or a high river to tide ratio are going to be similar to that the distribution that we saw for sea level rise. Whereas if you have like a lower river tide ratio, you probably are going to do that more slowly, meaning that distribution shifts slightly younger because you just don't have the same sediment supply to build those wetlands. If you're closer to the coast, it might be a little bit more complex with like a higher peak as after sea level rise, but then also a bunch of cores that are younger because you have all those marine processes that are causing shifts in the environment, and therefore wetlands are eroding or they're forming because there's just so much going on in the dynamics of an estuary. And we also would expect, if we see this anthropogenic pulse, we would expect it after European colonization. So we would expect younger cores after that European colonization to be part of this distribution. So when we look at this, it can be very complex if we add all these different drivers together, but hopefully through disentangling some of this, we can get to understand what these drivers mean for the formation of wetlands. So the first thing that we found, which we weren't really expecting, was that the purpose of the study in our core database really mattered. So we're looking at a very similar graph to what I just described in the predictions. We have age, with the older ones being on the right-hand side, the younger ones on the left, and then the proportion of cores on the Y. And what we're seeing is that with sea level rise studies, so studies that go back and look at historic sea level rise through time, so they're really selecting long cores that have a lot of different places that they can date to track sea level rise through time. So they're going out to a marsh and trying to find a stable place with a long core. they're going to have an older date in them because that's what they wanted. They wanted to be able to date sea level rise. So that really kind of skewed some of our results because of the number of places that, or the number of studies that were sea level rise studies, versus the ones that were not sea level rise studies. We kind of see in the orange here a distribution that's a little bit more varied. So the first takeaway is that we need to do more work on this, that we don't have enough studies that are just looking at what are the age of wetlands along our coast. We don't have enough that are just going out there and coring randomly versus selecting places that are really stable and old. Okay, so if we look at the river to tide ratio, again, the measure of a watershed versus an estuary, with the blue being big rivers and the yellow being more of a lagoonal environment, we can see that, as expected, the places that are connected to a river are older. They tend to have built pretty fast after the sea level rise slowed down, and then the other places that are more lagoonal or an estuary environment have more varied, and the yellow and the green ages associated with them. We can also look at this regionally. So going from Maine to the Gulf Coast, we can see that places like Maine and the Mid-Atlantic, the Gulf Coast, have this peak really as sea level rise slowed down, and they form pretty quickly after that. Whereas places like the Northeast and the Southeast, oh, I forgot to orient you to something else in the graph. The black line is the expected, or is around about the time of European colonization. So anything kind of to the left of the black line could possibly be formed after that. So we see in places like the Northeast and the Southeast, there seems to be more of a signal that could have been happening in these places, where Maine, Mid-Atlantic, Gulf Coast, we're not seeing that as much. We also find that increasing distance from the coast really affects this. So H, or the top graph, is the farthest away from the coast. I, or the bottom graph, is the closest to the coast. And as you can see, as you go from H to I, that you move from really kind of things forming quickly after sea level rise slowed to at I, it being a very, very different distribution, where we have kind of ages all over the place because of those dynamics that are happening in the coastline, where we have a more dynamic environment where things are changing and things are forming more quickly or more recently than you have in more stable areas kind of upstream of that. So what does that mean? It means that our reasons for wetlands forming are kind of varied, and that there are a lot of different variables that can affect that, both from the watershed and the river being super important to provide sediment to those wetlands, to possibly humans driving some of this, to your distance from the coast driving some of this. And I think that this not only goes for wetland formation, it also goes for wetland persistence. So we're seeing that these are some of the really big first order drivers of why we see wetlands forming, and probably why we would see wetlands persisting. So sediment supply will be important. You know, what's happening upstream? Is there a dam? Is there deforestation happening? Could also be important. And finally, your distance from the coast could be important, because storms are going to have a really big influence on the ability of a wetland to survive. Okay, so now we've talked about how these places form, and how that might be also an indicative of their persistence, and how they're connected to larger systems like watersheds. Next, we're going to try to put some humans in the system and talk about how humans can affect these ecosystems. So this is new work. I'm really excited to talk about it, but it's not quite done yet, but it's exciting to think about. So we know that human alteration of our coastline is pervasive and persistent. Here's a picture from the Conservation Corps in the 1930s, where the Conservation Corps, with the New Deal in America, meant that there were ditches and mosquito ditches dug all along our coastlines. And that means that our New England and New York and places like that still have the remnants of this. So this is a picture from Long Island, and you can see those mosquito ditches along the salt marshes just kind of marking across the whole thing. And they're still there. Like New England is full of them, and they are persistent, you know, over the time period from the 30s to now, meaning that they didn't just go away, and there's something that we have to deal with in our environment. We've also seen in places like the Southeast that we have a really unfortunate history of rice plantations, where they would dike and ditch salt marshes to grow rice pre-Civil War. And those ditches still exist in our scarring our ecosystems. So here's a picture from Florida where, 150, 200 years later, we still see those ditches. So these are also persistent within time periods of memory and time periods of importance with humans, meaning that these changes to landforms are things that we need to deal with and we need to understand better, because these ecosystems are functioning in a different way based on that geomorphology, that change in geomorphology, but we're not really accounting for what those changes are and what does that mean for wetlands going forward. So my colleagues and I are really trying to think broadly about this along many different ecosystems, not just salt marshes. So how pervasive are these altered landscapes? Do we see them everywhere? Are there really certain places that we see a lot of altered landscapes? How do they function? Are they different from natural systems? Are there things that are better or worse for ecosystem services? Over what timescales do these novel landforms maintain themselves or not? Do they, as we saw, those landforms, the ditches and the canals are persistent over periods of time that matter for humans, but how long do they persist otherwise? And are there consistent, predictable geomorphic shifts in landscapes with similar geologies and climates? So are we as humans really changing a bunch of landscapes to meet our needs in a particular direction? Like, are we draining things? Are we adding water to things based on what that climate and geology is? So we started with kind of a lit review of all of the most cited works in geomorphology and tried to understand what they were looking at and where they were looking at it. So anything in the green is natural in these bar graphs. Anything in the yellow is like an altered system, and it's just the number of sites per different type of climate and wetness and landform, and then looking at a map of where they occur. And as you expect, most of these studies occur in Europe and North America, where there's adequate funding and adequate people to do these things, really biasing our understandings of geomorphology to those systems and our understandings of novel geomorphology to those systems. We also find, kind of less expected, that mountains seem to be the things most studied. There are some coastal studies, but less so. I guess the biggest takeaway is that we have far, far fewer studies on altered systems versus natural systems, meaning that our understanding of these systems hasn't been fully reached, and we're not really thinking about, we're not really taking into account these systems as we should be, considering how pervasive they are. We also find that they're mainly done in wet environments and then warm or cool environments, also biasing the ways that we think about these systems. So we looked at 3 different types of systems: legacy agriculture in the Piedmont of the United States. So this is a place where farming was done 200 years ago. It has since been reforested, but we see the effects of that, meaning that going from the left-hand side, so A, C, and E, and to the right-hand side, B, D, and F, we see the more natural system versus the one that's been affected. And with legacy agriculture, we find that there's like rilling and erosion and huge amounts of drainage off these systems, even though they've been reforested. We also looked at mountaintop mining, which is in Appalachia in the United States, where they basically take the tops of mountains and put them into the hollows or the valleys of these areas, meaning that they cover up the natural drainage system, and they also change the elevation, where you go from highs and lows to everything being more of a median elevation, which really changes the drainage network for those systems. And then finally, as we've talked about, the salt marsh ditching, so going from E to F, you see a more natural system with natural tidal creeks, to F being one with still the natural tidal creeks, but then you see the marking of those mosquito ditches going through. So we looked at each of these and tried to take a measure of like what impact this had on the plumbing of these systems. And I'm not going to talk about mountaintop mining or legacy agriculture, because that's not what we're here for. We're all coastal people. I'm going to talk about what we found for the salt marshes, and what we found looking at those natural and then those more novel or altered systems was that when we think about elevation on the left-hand side, we see that there are more places with lower elevation than there would be in a more natural system. So we're looking at the shape of the curve here, basically, where the black ones have this really steep drop off, in elevation where there's very few places that have low elevation, where the red ones have a more, the curve is more gradual, where we have more places with a lower elevation, meaning those ditches are really increasing the lower elevation places and increasing the drainage off the land, off the marsh. And we can also look at the outlets, or the number of outlets to the marsh that were dug by those ditches. And on the right-hand side, and we can see that in the red of the novel places that have far higher number of outlets based on wetland area. So we used wetland area as a way to normalize this. So they have far higher number of outlets than the more natural systems in the black, which have a lower number of outlets, really showing that these systems are draining faster because of the plumbing has changed. And then we try to think about, okay, what does this mean conceptually? So we can think about this within the socioeconomic, technological settings of the time, where we have a climate or a geomorphic template that we have a goal for, and based on that goal, we're going to create a novel landform. So if our goal is like extraction or habitation, we're going to drain, and then that might have an effect on another landform, but those things age, they also might maintain themselves, and now we have this aging novel landform, especially in these systems that we're thinking about in salt marshes, the ditches and the canals, and a really new socioeconomic technological setting, and also a non-stationary template, as in like our climate is changing. So we have to think about, okay, what is this novel landform? How is it operating? Is it are our options restoration, or do we reassess it for use? Do we still find it functional, or do we abandon it and hope that it'll like disappear, or the system will function just fine, even though it has that legacy with it? So we're really trying to understand this, thinking about it at bringing into the human and the human reasons why we did it, and what might be the best outcome for these systems going forward. Okay. Thanks for bearing with me with that. That's all new, so I'm excited to talk about it, but it's also just like it's a little bit new, but it's really exciting to think about how humans can affect these marshes, like the one here we see. And you can even see in this picture, if you look closely enough, there's like some boat docks, there's some paths in it. So even though it seems natural, humans are everywhere in these systems, and it's really important to take them into account. Okay, last part is putting it all together in the MacroSystem Framework. So when we think about patterns of wetland extent in the United States, there are places that have really extensive wetlands. And what I mean by that is that when you think about the total estuary area, there are high percentage of wetlands versus open water. So in this case, in the Sea Islands of Georgia, you can see in the bright green here, lots of wetlands that are very extensive. They're very big compared to their open water, the open water there in those estuaries. We also have other places where there's a lot of open water relative to the wetlands. So this is the Neuse River in North Carolina. And again, you can see in the bright green, the wetlands, that they're more fringing. They're not as extensive as that Sea Island example we have here. And when we look along the United States, there's varying patterns. So the amount of greenness in this figure of the United States shows you where the places are that have really extensive wetlands versus where the places are that have more fringing wetlands or less extensive wetlands. So the question is, like, what is really driving these patterns? What are the things that are operating in these systems that drive the ability of that system to have extensive wetlands? And basically sum it down to, why are there extensive coastal wetlands here and not here? And can we pick apart those drivers? So we did this through GIS geoprocessing, and again, the response variable is wetland extent, or the percentage of wetland within that estuary versus open water. And we looked at several different things that we thought were going to drive that pattern. So watershed characteristics, again, the river is important for providing sediment and providing the ability for a wetland to grow. Estuary characteristics, both depth and size of your estuary, shoreline development, trying to add people into it. And we use those data to assess these things at different scales. So we use HUC, which is the hydrologic unit code, which is the USGS's way of dividing up different watersheds. And they go from very small, which is like the Huck 12 scale, which is this like a sub-tributary of the Neuse River, for instance. It's like a creek coming in the Neuse River, going all the way up to Huck 4, which is the biggest scale, which would be the hull of the Albemarle Pamlico Sound, like just a very big area. So we looked at these different processes at different scales to try to pick apart, like at what scale are these different drivers operating, trying to pick that down to different scales. So again, we know that soil elevation is driven vertically, and that we've thought a lot about how vertical dynamics can affect wetland persistence, as we talked about earlier. But there's also these lateral dynamics, so taking things horizontal, where as you have more open water, that fetch or the wind-driven waves can increase, and that can cause shoreline erosion, which means that you can kind of go to a more fringing wetland, versus places with smaller open water, that fetch or the wind-driven waves just don't have the space to like build up, and so you can go to more extensive wetlands. And Mariotti and Fiorazzi really showed through a model that that these possibly could be alternative attractors, where with some threshold of open water area, you go on one side, you run away towards more fringing wetlands because you have more erosion and more fetch. And on the other side, you go to like more extensive wetlands because you have less open water and those wetlands are able to build. And here's an example, or here's their graph from their paper, where you have sediment concentration and threshold basin width. So that's just that threshold between you, on one side you go to expanding and the other side you go to contracting. And what they're really showing in here is that things like sea level rise and sediment concentration can have play a role in where that threshold is going towards that more extensive or less extensive wetland. And our prediction really is, when we look at this across the Gulf and Atlantic coasts, that we should see, if these are two attractors, if we do have running away towards extensive or fringing wetlands, that this should be a bimodal distribution where we have these two attractors showing up in our data set of wetland extent. And so we looked at this across different areas, going from very tiny to very large, very tiny on the left and very large on the right, and looked at increasing evidence of positive multimodality, or like positive bimodality in our distribution. And we found that we're really seeing this play out at very small areas. So at more local scale, at the small areas here on A, we see more bimodal distribution. We have fringing wetlands and extensive wetlands, whereas you go to the larger areas there on E, where it's like gray, we're only seeing fringing wetlands because the open water area has gotten so big that it runs away to fringing wetlands. So this is really showing that this operator works at this smaller scale, that this attractor happens at these smaller scales. And so just to orient you to this graph, because I'm going to come back to it, basically the larger estuaries on the left, the smaller estuaries on the right, so smaller estuaries on the right, so going up in scale from left to right, or down in scale and left to right, we see that these internal feedbacks are really operating at this small scale, as indicated by this black color here. And we'll go through these other hypotheses in just a minute. So we also looked at the rivers. So again, this is river to tide ratio. So expecting that a small watershed versus estuary, you're going to have less sediment supply and therefore probably less extensive wetlands. Where if you have a larger watershed relative to your estuary, you would have a bigger sediment supply and therefore probably more extensive wetlands. And so we would expect, our prediction is that wetland extent will increase as river to tide ratio increases, where you have more places with the more dominant river with a higher river to tide ratio. And when we put this into a regression model, we find that we see this happening at the bigger size, the Huck 4 and the Huck 6 scale, and interacting with estuary areas, so that places with that have the bigger estuaries, you are seeing that the higher river to tide ratio matters, so that these places that have more sediment are going to have more extensive wetlands, and that's really happening at these large scales on the order of like Albemarle Pamlico Sound, and at the smaller scale, it seems to be less important. We also looked at shoreline complexity, so that's a measure of how complex that estuary and the shoreline is, because if you have a circle, your ability to build up wind-driven waves is much better than than a star of the same area, because just the complexity of your shoreline means you can't build as much wind-driven waves. And so does that matter in the wetland patterns we see? So we would think that with increasing complexity, you would also see increasing wetland extent. And what we find is that so this is at the Huck 12 scale, and we can see that there's a lot of things in the middle, but the wetland extent at the very left-hand side, so where you really have a very circular thing, tends to be all down at low numbers, meaning that the wind-driven waves can operate better. And at the right-hand side, at the top, we seem to have like more wetland extent, meaning that the complexity might be playing a role there with the ability of those wind-driven waves to build up. But in reality, there's a lot of things going on here, and that this does not seem to be probably the most important factor. We do see it operating, though, at these really small scales. So this seems to be more of an important driver at the like Huck 10 and Huck 12 scale, kind of the same level that we see the alternative feedbacks happening. So that's not unexpected that fetch seems to play a role when you really get into these more smaller scale environments. So when we look at this whole thing, it's very complex. These are all, again, like regression results with the effects on there, and anything that's significant is a colored box with the arrow indicating the direction of the effect and the size of the effect. But what I really wanted to point out here is that there's some things that are operating at this very large scale, like estuary area, like river to tide ratio and depth, meaning that those are like more regional patterns of like big rivers and big estuaries playing a role in the patterns that we see. Whereas things like the fetch dominated interactions happening at this really small scale. So we see that things like shoreline complexity and the internal feedbacks that we have operating in that scale, but also things like the shoreline land use seems to become more significant at that scale as well. So within this framework, we can start to parse out, okay, where are these drivers of wetlands persistence really operating, and like how can we best think about them all together as they're influencing each other? Okay, so we're back here, and I'm going to quickly go through this because I realize I'm running out of time. So we've talked about what is a macro system. We've talked about local processes and how these large-scale disturbances can really have an effect on the persistence of a wetland by affecting the soil building processes. We also talked about wetland formation and how larger watershed and marine drivers can affect wetland formation and possibly thereby affect wetland persistence. But that's a complex, situation because there's so many drivers. When we put humans in the system, we can see that humans really change our landforms, and that it's a ripe area for digging in and trying to figure out what does that mean and how do these ecosystems function and how will they persist through time. And finally, when we put it all together, we can see that these drivers are operating at different scales, from the very small scale to the scale of very large estuaries. And that understanding at what scale these operators are driving can give us a better idea of how to manage those drivers, or to understand those drivers when thinking about your own focal site and why it's important. So I hope I've made today a little bit of an argument for thinking about wetlands at more of the macro scale, and trying to really distill those drivers and what scale they're operating at, because it's really important for thinking about wetland persistence, because it's not only small scale drivers of accretion that matter, but it's also these larger scale drivers of watershed land use and marine environments that can really influence how those wetlands persist and the patterns that we see. With that, I would like to acknowledge all of my co-authors, Jim Heffernan, Matt Kerwin, Julie Cherry, Chris May, Matt Ross, and John Mallard, and the myriad of funding that's gone to fund all of this work. And I will take any questions.
All right, thank you. Yeah, do we have any questions from anybody in the chat? Or you can unmute yourself and also speak up.
Hi, Corinne. Actually, I do.
Yeah.
Hi. Thank you for very interesting. It might be a very naive question, but so we keep hearing more and more about extreme events, storm, heat wave, and things like that. Have you done any research on how some of these extreme events will affect persistence of wetlands, in your on the US, and like what do we know about that, especially like storm and things like that?
Yeah.
or flooding?
I've done less research on extreme events and wetland persistence. I've done more research on extreme events on like coastal vulnerability from coastal communities perspectives. But we know from, some of the research that things like storms, it really depends on where you are in that storm's path and like whether you're hitting the side, whether you're getting the side that the water's getting pushed in on, or you're hitting the side that the water's getting pushed out on, can really depend whether you're eroding or accreting or if it's burying. So I think it depends. I think that the main thing is like these systems move. They're all moving, and the extreme events can really cause drastic changes in the movements, kind of like a barrier island. Like the big storms are going to move that barrier island faster. I think that thinking about the increase in extreme events, I think the thing to think about is more movement and being ready for that movement, whether that be if that marsh is migrating, is there a place cleared, or is it going to be hitting up against human communities or gray infrastructure? Trying to think about the ways that movement might change what your landscape looks at if those big storms are happening more frequently. But I think extreme events are super interesting. And thinking about how our coastal dynamics are going to change quickly is really interesting.
Thanks.
All right. Do we have anybody else? Not gonna lie, this is probably one of the subjects I have almost no familiarity with. So
That's okay.
usually I try to form some like awesome, whatever, insightful question, but as much as I can anyway. But
Sorry,
actually,
I also just gave you a fire hose. So
yeah, my question is more general. Like, what is a mosquito ditch? Like, I'm from the West Coast. I'm from Washington State. I've never heard of a mosquito ditch before.
Yeah. So it was a way to try to keep mosquitoes from breeding. They put mosquito ditches in to try to keep standing water from happening in wetlands. So they were there to drain. And the crazy thing about them is they both, that they're so prolific. They're just completely scratched across the Northeast. And because of the crazy interaction with the New Deal, so the New Deal in the US put so much money towards these things like conservation corps, where they were just giving money to people to do all of this infrastructure work. And at the time, that infrastructure work was mosquito ditches. So a really interesting combination of both like, history and economic drivers interacting with ecosystems. So.
It reminded me a little bit of trawl scars on the seafloor, where it's just, there's, it's not going to change overnight. It's going to take, or it's just going to be part of the environment now.
Yeah.
And everything's going to grow around it.
Yeah.
So that was really interesting how it stayed like that.
Yeah.
And didn't go back to normal.
Geologists will say, it will change eventually, but over timescales that we care about, we're only here on this earth for a certain amount of time. So over timescales we care about, it's not going to change. So, what I think it matters on your perspective about whether it's something that we need to address or not. So.
Yeah. Also I just had like a basic question from the dams. Being from Washington, in my area, there's this estuary called Gray's Bay or Gray's Harbor Bay, that area. And there's a river that runs to it, a main river that runs to it, called the Chehalis River. And there's a lot of flooding. Like this past winter, there was a lot of flooding. So what they're trying to do is they're going to try to dam it so they can do some flood control. But in that estuary, they do oyster aquaculture.
Yeah.
There's a salmon population. So they do a lot of salmon gill netting. There's fisheries there. Yeah, and there's mussels, oysters. There's razor clams in the intertidal. So there's all this other stuff. And how would the sedimentation that isn't going to be going, and the water flow too, like how it's going to be a lot more controlled, I guess. How would that kind of affect the estuary, like a brand new dam? How is that on the main river?
Yeah. So dams really trap sediment. behind a dam, you have this like slack water. It basically turns into like a reservoir or lake, which means that all the sediment drops out and it settles there. So you get this like really clean water that comes out of the base of it, which is bad in many different ways. Like that water is also often like colder. It can be different water quality than what you would expect from upstream. And so it changes the dynamics of the ecosystem just downstream of the dam as well. But you know, what can happen is that depending on the use of the dam or who the upstream users are, sometimes you have less water coming down. Sometimes the dynamics of that river have changed. So you don't have as, you know, the water is released at different times or different ways. Yeah, you might not have as many floods, but sometimes those floods are important to the ecosystem. So it really is this balance between human needs versus ecosystem needs. And there's, you know, there's huge fights here in Florida, for instance, between Florida and Georgia for the Apalachicola, where you have, you know, water use being an issue versus oysters and fish downstream, and what kind of water they need to survive versus what do the, you know, the humans in Georgia and the farmers and the cities in Georgia need. So it can really be like this complicated situation. Dams are really complex, and sometimes it's this like weighing between the marine ecosystems that need certain things, or the riverine ecosystems that need certain things, and humans that also need certain things. And you know, there's places in Washington where they're taking them out, like the Elwha, but the bigger dams and can be an issue, and certainly new dams are can be really contentious. So
Yeah, so you just brought up what I was going to ask. You know, you said the Elwha. I know a lot of people are petitioning to take out the Snake River dams, and probably some of the upper Columbia River dams too, I'm assuming. So what would that mean to the communities, you know, downstream, in terms of the sedimentation and in terms of the water flow? Like, what would that mean towards, you know, the mouth of the Columbia, or, you know, if they took those dams out?
yeah, I mean, I know some about the Columbia, less than I would like. I mean, I certainly know that there are like native communities along the Columbia that have seen their fisheries totally decrease, and that, you know, really actively advocating for the removal of those dams. You know, it would change the flow because they're so controlled now, and the ability to keep that water back means that the flooding will definitely change. And even the geomorphology will change. We saw that with the Elwha, is that oftentimes the sediment that's held back can also mean that there's like a lot of sediment that comes through once that dam is gone, but also it like really carves a channel through that sediment that's been held back. So it can change a lot of things. And I've definitely seen the advocacy for changing the Columbia and the Snake, but I can't speak directly to that because I just don't know enough. So
That makes sense. Yeah, I was just curious, you know, I
yeah.
figured you weren't an expert in every single tributary and watersheds and stuff.
I mean, dams are super interesting because it's just it's such a complicated situation.
Yeah.
And we were so prolific at building them through the, you know, 30s to the 70s. Like we built them everywhere. So
threw them.
yeah. Yeah. So yeah.
Okay, Jin, you have a question?
Oh, hi, Anna. I'm just curious with in wetlands with all those disturbances of hurricanes and fires. Do you see like chance events such as invasive vegetation changes for invasive species?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Actually, not even just invasive species, like things like mangroves are really so in Florida we have tropicalization, which means that our marshes are slowly turning into mangroves because the freeze point in Florida is like moving north, which is really determines like where mangroves can move. And when there's studies that have shown that hurricanes are often the reason that like mangroves all of a sudden like spurt up into other places, is because their propagules can't move as fast, except for during these storm events where they're really driven northward quite quickly. And so it's always like the next storm that seems to be when that line of mangroves moves into more northern areas. So yes, there are things like invasives and even just native plants that are changing as those storm events happen.
cool. Very cool system.
Thanks.
We had the Spartina invasion
Yeah, on the
in
West Coast.
Washington,
Yeah, absolutely.
which was very interesting because I watched it in my lifetime over the course of, a few years. It just all of a sudden it went from these mud flats to poof, we had salt marshes
Yeah.
or whatever you call them. But
Yeah, yeah.
it was really interesting.
It's
It
also
really
interesting
reshaped
for
everything.
yeah, East Coast ecologists and wetland ecologists go to the West Coast and they're like, oh, this looks great. It's like all invasive because Spartina is like the main thing here, and then it's so invasive. It's also invasive in places like China. There's lots of places that Spartina is like not wanted. So yeah, it can happen very quickly.
Yeah, the oyster growers were really unhappy about it.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, well, I think we can wrap that up now. If we don't have any more questions, yeah, so thank you so much for coming and giving a seminar. I really like the diversity in this one because we don't really have a lot of the terrestrial, where that meets the sea kind of thing. So it's really good to learn about that kind of stuff. So I really appreciate you being here. And
Yeah, of course. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, all right, cool. All right, well, everybody, see you next week. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Just got to figure out how to leave.
I'll kick you out.
Okay. Thank you.